No, it just records you.
Oh, is that right? Okay, cool.
So, or us. So let me just introduce Lynne briefly, although I think for many of you, Lynne doesn't need any introduction. But the Reverend Dr. Lynne Baab completed her PhD on communication studies at the University of Washington in 2007. And she was then lecturer and senior lecturer in pastoral theology here in the Theology Programme at the University of Otago from 2007 to 2017. Lynne and Dave returned to Seattle, but are currently in New Zealand having a COVID break, as it were. And Lynne also teaches as an adjunct professor at Hope International University. Lynne is the author of around 20 books. You'll find lots of details on her website, lynnebaab.com, where Lynne also blogs a great deal with lots of interesting things and has many of her articles there too. But amongst Lynne's many books, Reaching Out in a Networked World, Expressing Your Congregation's Heart and Soul, The Power of Listening, Building Skills for Mission and Ministry, Joy Together, Spiritual Practices for Your Congregation, Sabbath Keeping, Finding Freedom in the Rhythms of Rest, and A Renewed Spirituality, Finding Fresh Paths in Midlife. So we'll have Lynne's presentation now, and then we'll have a chance for questions and answers Q&A via the chat room, and I'll explain that when we get to that section. But Lynne, over to you.
Thanks. Well, thanks everybody so much for being here. Such a privilege to get to tell you this story. So I want to tell you that I have two main points I'm going to make. And when I get to those points, I will very carefully say, this is one of my main points, and this is my other main point. I want to tell you what this talk is not. This talk is not a discussion of the biblical passages about homosexuality. That's one thing it isn't. And the other thing it is not a suggestion that you do what this church did. I'm going to describe what one specific church did, and I'm just hoping that it might trigger some discussion for you, some thoughts, some interest in maybe picking up one thing that this congregation did, but maybe not even that. I just want to stimulate some of your thinking. So please don't think I'm saying that, you should do what this congregation did. So the congregation. Some of you will have visited Seattle, and if you visited Seattle, you probably went up the Space Needle. And even if you've never visited Seattle, you've probably seen the Space Needle in some picture. So if you imagine standing at the base of the Space Needle and you have a really good arm and you throw a rock north as far as you can throw, that is where this church was founded. In 1888, it was Second Presbyterian Church in Seattle. A couple decades later, it changed its name to Bethany Presbyterian Church. And in 1930, it moved up to the top of Queen Anne Hill. So if you were on the Space Needle looking to the north, you would have a really steep hillside going up. And they would be covered with houses and apartment buildings. And then you'd get the top of the hill is flat. And the church is on Queen Anne Avenue North. So in the picture that Paul is screen sharing with you, you can see the 1930s building. You can't see that there's a 1930s wing off to the right behind the tree. And then on the left there, you can see the 1990s fellowship hall that was added. And then further to the left of the fellowship hall is three houses going up a side street. And one of those is the church offices, one is some meeting rooms, and one is a youth house. So it's a campus, I think that's the word they use, a campus with a 30s building and some other buildings on it. Before the pandemic, there were 325 people in worship on a Sunday morning. Who knows, what's going to happen after the pandemic, for sure. Bethany, since the 1960s, has been what would probably be called a solid evangelical church. And this is evangelical in the sense that would have been used 50 years ago. This is not evangelical in the religious right sense that you hear in the news. So this means it's a church really committed to biblical preaching, expositional preaching, a church committed to overseas mission, local mission, children's programs, youth programs, and prayer, lots of kinds of prayer. So I want to start with a meeting with Doug Kelly, who you can see in that picture there, the senior minister, in October of 2013. So Dave and I were living in New Zealand. We were here in Dunedin. I was teaching at the university, and we went back to the US. We actually went back for a high school reunion of Dave's. And we were in Seattle during that high school reunion, or after the high school reunion. And Doug asked me if I would get together with him for coffee. Now, I had never met him. He'd been at the church 9 months, but he knew that I had been an associate pastor there from 1997 to 2004. So 7 years. I was an associate pastor there for 7 years. And he wanted to pick my brains about church culture. So we walked from the church up Queen Anne Avenue, 2 or 3 blocks, to a cafe. We went in the cafe, we sat there, we got coffee, and he said, okay, now I've observed this about the congregation. Where did that come from? Who were the prime movers about that? Why is that a part of this church culture? So he's just trying to kind of pick my brains about the history of the church. And then he gets to Bethany's sexuality policy, which I helped write. So this is a 2002 sexuality policy that says that sexual intercourse belongs in heterosexual marriage, a marriage between a man and a woman. And this 2002 policy is still in effect in 2013. And so he's asking me questions about who were the main actors in forming that policy, and what caused it to happen, and what were the forces, and all that kind of stuff. So, to the best of my ability, I told him what I remembered, what I knew. Now, later in a sermon, I heard Doug describe what that policy meant to him. So 2012 is the year that Doug was looking for a position. He had been at a church in Southern California, and the denomination, the Presbyterian Church USA, had decided in 2012 that openly gay people could be ministers and elders. They could be ordained in the PCUSA. And Doug did not agree with that policy at all. He knew he would not be comfortable in a congregation that was really on board with the denomination. And so when he started applying at Bethany and interviewing, and he saw that they had this sexuality policy, he was delighted. Great. This is a church where he basically was laughing, because he said, I thought I was coming to a church where this was a settled issue, and I just wouldn't have to deal with it. Could get on with ministry. It's all settled. It's all fine. Okay. So he's hired at Bethany, comes in early 2013. Even by the time I was talking to him at the end of 2013, he's already aware, and it becomes more aware the next year. There's a lot of people at Bethany who do not agree with Bethany's policy. There's a lot of them who are longing for it to change. And there's a lot of gay and lesbian people at the church who come. And Doug, big heart, wants to welcome the gay and lesbian people. He wants to welcome the people who don't agree with Bethany's policy. And he wants to welcome the people who do agree with Bethany's policy. And he's realizing, hey, it's been 11 years, 12 years by the time he's kind of proposing this to the Board of Elders. We need to talk about this. We need to talk about the fact that, there's just a lot of people not on board with this policy that we still have and we still affirm. Now, one of the reasons why I'm saying to you that it's not likely that you're going to want to do everything the way that this church did it is because Doug is a unique personality. He loves controversy. He loves taking a group of people through a contentious issue. He loves discussing hard things. This is like his meat and drink. He just thinks this is great. I'm just like, I don't want controversy. I don't want contentiousness. I don't want conflict. I don't, and so when he tells me that, in a later conversation, that this is like one of his joys, I'm just like, did you come from outer space or something? Because, most of us Christians, we don't really like controversy that much. But I have to say, I think that he has I want to say babysat a process. That is not the right word. Supervised, shepherded a process that's really quite remarkable. So he starts 2014, he starts talking with the session. Now I'll just, little aside, in PCUSA congregations, the Board of Elders is called a session. There's no other name for it. So I'm just going to say session for this, what you would probably call a parish council in Presbyterian churches in New Zealand. Okay, so the session, he starts talking with them. They start talking about what they might do. They hire a consultant to come in. I wanted to give you this language of communal discernment consultants. And these communal discernment consultants led small group discussions, large group discussions, they moderated all kinds of stuff. People gave all kinds of input over the course of many, many months and going into more than a year. So lots of input. And then the session started talking about it, and that went on. The whole process from the beginning of the consultations to a new policy took 2.5 years. So that's, noteworthy that, as all of you know, nothing happens very fast in churches. But what was interesting about the session itself was that there were people on the session who really wanted to get rid of that 2002 policy. There were people on the session who really liked the 2002 policy. And there were people in the middle, and kind of ironically, a couple of the people in the middle had spouses who were way on the end of the spectrum. And so those people in the middle, a couple of them are trying to represent their spouses. Now, you might wonder, I wasn't there. Dave and I were in New Zealand when a lot of this was going on, but I still have a lot of friends at that church, and they would tell me about it. I had friends on the session. Doug would tell me about it. So I felt like I was following the process, even though I wasn't even there. Okay, so we get to 2017, November, and the new policy is now passed. And Paul is going to screen share again, and I'm going to show you the name of this policy. And the reason I'm going to show you the name is it's not really easy to find on the church website. At the end, I'm going to give you the church website address. But if you just Google, if you want to read the whole thing, 2017 Statement on Ordained Leadership and Program Staff, Bethany Presbyterian Church. If you Google that, you get there, because that's how I found it just a couple of weeks ago when I was preparing this talk. So the section that we're interested in for this talk is the section Unity and Diversity at Bethany Presbyterian Church. And in just a minute, not quite yet, but in just a minute, I'm going to read it. The section, I'm not going to read the whole section, mind you. The section starts with 9 areas that the session determined that they were agreed upon. And these are, again, I made a list of some of them to read to you. The primacy of the triune God, the significance of the grace of God, the authority of the Bible, the reality of human sin, the need to rely on the Holy Spirit. So these are things, the reason I'm not going to read them to you in detail is because I just really don't think that many of you would, think that they're very controversial, but the controversial part comes after that. So Paul, go to the next slide, and I'm going to start reading here. At the same time, as a body of believers, we are not united. So I should pause and say that earlier section with the 9 things is kind of called united. We are united about this. We are united about that. We are united about this. But we are not united in our understanding beliefs about the place of individuals in monogamous gay relationships in the life of the church. Some of us believe that the Bible gives clear prohibitions against homosexual acts and that Jesus followers may not be in a same-sex relationship while still remaining faithful to our Lord. Others of us, while acknowledging these biblical texts, believe that they address ancient Roman and Greek homoerotic practices that were oppressive and idolatrous, rather than the monogamous committed relationships of some in the Christian LGBTQ community. As a body of believers, we are not of one mind of this matter, and we live in the tension of this reality. We are not completely comfortable in this place, but this is where we are. So there's a couple more statements about unity, and then it goes on about ordination. We affirm that the ordained leadership is the result of a mutually discerned calling, and that ordained leadership and staff submit to the lordship of Christ in all of life. We recognize that the stewardship of one's sexuality is one of many factors in the call process. Our position is that one's sexual orientation and living out of that orientation, now don't move the slide at the end of the sentence, I want to talk about this. Our position is that one's sexual orientation and living out of that orientation through chastity and singleness or fidelity in marriage does not preclude consideration of ordination. So I want you to look at that, because that is saying that someone who agrees to be ordained as an elder in our congregation is making a commitment to chastity and singleness or fidelity in marriage. So, there's a lot of rhetoric about promiscuity in the gay community. And this is basically saying that a gay person who agrees to be in any kind of leadership in this congregation is going to be chaste in singleness or faithful in marriage. Now, in the United States now, every state has gay marriage. And so this could be a person who is in a gay marriage. But anyway, so this is an interesting statement because it's still affirming a level of faithfulness in sexuality that many churches who welcome LGBTQ plus people might not state in this way. Okay, so now you can go on to the next slide. The statement on ordained leadership and program staff neither affirms nor rejects monogamous same-sex relationships. We are not in agreement on this issue. We recognize that our approach to this issue is particularly troublesome for those who believe that a faithful Christian should not be in a same-sex relationship. So one more slide, I think, of this policy. Maybe it's two. No, this is the end. Okay. However, at the same time, we believe this is not an essential issue of Christian discipleship, nor an issue we need to resolve in our written leadership standards. The statement on ordained leadership and program staff treats affirmation of monogamous same-sex relationships as a disputable matter. By disputable, we mean that this is an area in which faithful Christians can disagree but remain in communion with each other. So this policy was a big deal. People for 2.5 years had been waiting to see what would happen. So immediately, one of the session members, one of the elders who had been in favor of the old policy, he immediately resigned from session and left the church. We had a total of, let's see, I wrote this down too. We had a total of 15 additional people who left the church publicly, saying goodbye and saying, I can't be here anymore. But what you'll be interested in possibly is that most of them left because the policy was too liberal, but a few of them left because the policy was too conservative. They were hoping that Bethany would choose to be what's called an open and affirming congregation. That would basically say gay marriage is fine and we're going ahead with allowing gay people. We're not making a space for people who hold a conservative view on this issue. And that's what they were hoping. So they left and they went somewhere else. So this was, I'm smiling about it now because I think it's amusing that people left for both reasons. But at the time, I was heartbroken. Dave and I had arrived back in the US in July of 2017. This policy passed in November of 2017. And of those 16 people who left, several of them were very old friends of mine. And they're not there anymore. And my heart was broken that people were leaving over this. I mean, my heart really was broken. The next thing that happened was for me anyway, was in February, March, April, somewhere in there in 2018. So Doug, the senior minister, calls me up and says, would you have lunch with me and this fellow Sprague, who I'll tell you who he is in just a minute. Would you have lunch with the two of us? I want to talk to you about something. So Sprague is a guy that I knew when I was a pastor there. I had heard through the grapevine that he was probably gay, but nothing was public. And so I never talked to him about it at all. But at the time of our meeting in 2018, he was in his mid to late 40s, and Sprague was in his early 40s when he came out as gay. So at the point that we're at this meeting, he had been publicly gay at church for several years. I'm not sure the exact number of years. So Sprague and Doug wanted to start a LGBTQ plus support group at church, and Doug wanted me to partner with Sprague in leading the group. So now I need to stop and go back and tell you some of my story. Why would it be that Doug would ask me to partner with Sprague in leading this group? So I want to go back, way, way, way back and tell you some of that story. So big sigh, big stopping point. I look back, I remember I'm 22 years old. I've just graduated from university. I'm going on staff with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which is the parallel to TSCF in New Zealand. And it's an evangelical Christian ministry. This is the mid 70s, and homosexuality is literally not on the radar for evangelical Christians at this point. So those of you who are in your 20s, 30s, 40s, I don't know if you can really imagine how much or how irrelevant homosexuality was in that time period. But I mean, it just was not an issue. So I've been on staff for 3 years. I was 25 years old, and my supervisor told me there's a book that's published by InterVarsity Press about homosexuality. I'd like you to read it, and I'd like you to lead a seminar at this conference coming up in a few months. So the book was called The Returns of Love by Alex Davidson. And there I am. And I read the book, and I was really impressed by his commitment to holiness, his commitment to wanting to follow Christ. His conclusion was the only possible path for a faithful gay person was celibacy. And I was really impressed, like I said, with his devotion. But, you know, I thought, well, he's given his view there. I'm quite sure there must be other views. And so, you know, I've heard that there's a church for gay people in Seattle. I really, you know, I should just go find out what's going on there. So I found out there was this congregation. It was part of this movement called Metropolitan Community Churches. I made an appointment to meet with a minister. The minister went through the 6 key passages with me as we met. He gave me his interpretation of the 6 passages, and they were not the same as the interpretation in the book. And I was not convinced by this gay minister, but I was also not really convinced by the book either. I just sort of held these interpretations very lightly, kind of wondering how do you discern when you've got different interpretations proposed to you about a topic? And the reason this was so real to me is that I had been on staff with InterVarsity for 3 years. I was speaking at conferences. I was supervising interns. I was in multiple leadership roles. I was very aware of 1 Timothy 2:12. I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. And here I am disobeying the straight meaning of a verse in the Bible. And so when someone says there's a straight meaning of every verse, and we're supposed to obey that straight meaning, I'm like, well, I'm already disobeying the straight meaning of a verse. And so how do I deal with this? So the whole homosexuality thing in the 70s, it was not an issue. Like I said, I did that seminar. I actually, it's sort of ironic now, at an InterVarsity Christian Fellowship seminar, I presented the material in the book, and I told them what this gay minister had told me at Metropolitan Community Church, and we talked, and it was over, and I put the issue aside and, didn't think about it really for years. However, a couple years later, a friend of mine from university, Jeff, told me he was gay. couple years later, Jeff met a guy named John. They are still together. They've been together since 1980. They completely missed the AIDS epidemic because they were faithful to each other. They're not Christians at all, but Jeff used to come to Seattle on business. He lives in Minnesota. He used to come to Seattle on business, and he and I would get together for lunch, and he would talk to me about him and John going on vacation. So Jeff is a huge extrovert, and John is a huge introvert. They're kind of on the opposite ends of the spectrum on introversion and extroversion. And when they go on vacations, Jeff wants to talk to all the people at the hotel, and he wants to strike up conversations with everybody. And John just wants to be alone. Hey, I'm on vacation. I don't want to talk to anybody. So, we're sitting in some coffee shop in Seattle when he's visiting in the 80s. And, I'm saying in Dave's and my case, I'm the introvert, Dave's the extrovert. We're not on way ends. We're closer to the middle, but still we go on vacation, and, Dave wants to talk to strangers and I don't. And, we have the exact same issue as Jeff and John. And I'm just thinking, they have a relationship that's just like a marriage. So all through the 80s, this is what I'm thinking, when we went to Minnesota, visited them, and, they're this relationship that Jeff and John has is just kind of, a background to my life. So in the 1990s, evangelicals started getting pretty worked up about homosexuality. They started really, it was a real litmus test issue in the 90s, not really before, I don't think, but in the 90s it was. And every time someone would talk to me about it, I would say, it's not my issue. I realized as the 90s went on, I agreed less and less with the evangelical interpretation of scriptures and more with the gay church interpretation of the scriptures. But it's not my issue. I'm not going to talk about it. I'm called to serve in evangelical churches. I'm called to speak into the evangelical world about prayer. And if I start becoming we didn't say LGBTQ back then, we said gay. If I start becoming a gay lesbian advocate, it's going to ruin my audience. And so it's not my issue. I don't speak up about this. But in the late 90s, there were a couple authors who really influenced me. Both evangelical, both of them changed their mind about homosexuality. One was Jack Rogers, one was David Myers. And I'll just tell you, at the very end, I've got a slide that has the website of the church, and all the books I'm mentioning are on the slide. I'm going to mention some more books. And so you can take a screenshot, or you can photograph the slide with your camera or something. So you have, I'm not going to give you like all the names now, but both Jack Rogers and David Myers wrote books. First, they wrote articles. I read their articles, and they wrote books, and they talked about why they changed their mind about homosexuality. Now, so the irony of I'm changing my mind about homosexuality too, and more I'm thinking, gay marriage is so much better than gay promiscuity. Why would Christians not affirm gay marriage? I just don't get it. But anyway, it's not my issue. I won't speak up. Our church then is doing this sexuality policy. And, I'm a writer. I like things that are written well. And so I could see the church is largely conservative, and I help formulate this policy that I don't actually agree with, but I want it well written. I mean, if my church is going to have a policy, I want to make sure it's well written. So I help write this policy. And as it's being written and approved, I'm thinking, I wonder if I'm going to end up leaving this church because of this policy. It might happen. It'll be interesting to see. That was 2002. So what would make me change my mind about it's not my issue? Well, January 2004, our younger son, Mike, told us he was gay. That'll make you change your mind about things pretty quick, or at least change your sense of what you're called to do and not do pretty quick. So I had some clues starting in October, like 3 months earlier, that Mike might be gay. And I had been actively praying, Lord, if he is gay, please help him tell us. So the comedy is he was studying in London that year. He came home for Christmas. And the night before he flew back to London in January, the night before, he drops his bomb on Dave and me, I'm gay, and then he disappears off to London so that we can process it on our own. Smart, Mike. That's a smart way to dump something on your parents. But anyway, literally before he even got on the plane, I mean, within 60 seconds of him telling me that he was gay, I knew I would have to leave Bethany as a pastor, associate pastor. I knew I couldn't be there anymore. They had a policy that would not welcome my son, so I couldn't be there anymore. So that was January of 2004. February of 2004, I felt a huge call to go into teaching. I thought that I would be teaching in an American seminary. March of 2004, I prepared applications to PhD programs. April was the deadline for applications. I was admitted, and September of 2004, I started a PhD in communication full-time at the University of Washington. Like I said, I thought I was preparing to teach at an American seminary, but in 2005, when I was job hunting, there was this job at this university in Dunedin, New Zealand. And I applied for it and was hired, and so ended up having 10 years of a teaching career here in New Zealand rather than in the US. Many of you who knew me in those 10 years did not know that I ended up in New Zealand because my son told me he was gay in January of 2004. So it's kind of a sequence for me. So I've now brought you kind of up to date about me. And that is why this whole story for me, I'd already told my senior pastor, Doug. Dave and I went back to Bethany Presbyterian Church in 2017. And I'd already told Doug this story. So that's why he asked me if I would help Sprague lead this group. So now I'm going to switch to talk a little bit about this group that we started. So the first thing that I asked Sprague is if we could bring in a third leader. And the reason I asked was I have a good friend named Margie, and she had been praying for several years about how she could be involved in supporting LGBTQ plus people at church. And Margie has given me permission to tell you a little of her story. Everyone I mentioned tonight has given me permission to tell their story. Margie was raised in Bolivia as a missionary kid, very conservative parents. She's about my age, so we're talking raised in Bolivia, 50s, 60s, 70s. She had a brother who she loved very much, who was gay, got AIDS in the 1980s, died completely estranged from Margie's parents, who had basically ostracized him when he let them know that he was gay. So Margie, a huge grief, lost her brother, and her brother was completely out of relationship with her parents, who she loved very much. Margie completely disagreed with Bethany's 2002 policy. She was repeatedly asked to serve as an elder after 2002 and repeatedly declined because she could not honestly affirm the 2002 policy. Margie would say that she was silenced from 2002 until 2017. And Margie would say that the people at Bethany who affirmed gay marriage and affirmed the ordination of gays and lesbians were silenced. And people who are more conservative on this view often talk about being silenced now, and yet there were a lot of people silenced in those years, and that would be one of the things that was important to her. Anyway, she was delighted to help lead this group. So the group kicked off in October of 2018, and the first thing that we did was talk about a name. We had like maybe a dozen people come to our first meeting, and what should we call our group? And I said, since we have a high view of scripture, maybe we should pick a verse of the Bible or something from the Bible to name ourselves from. And Sprague, the other co-leader, suggested Isaiah 43:1, a verse that had been very meaningful to him. But now, thus says the Lord, he who created you, O Jacob, he who formed you, O Israel, do not fear. For I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. So this group met twice a month, starting that month of October 2018. We met after church on a Sunday morning. We would all bring our lunches, sit around and talk. We did a number of book discussions. One of the first books we discussed was Matthew Vines's book, God and the Gay Christian. And Matthew Vines has founded a group called the Reformation Project. And we went to a Reformation Project conference that was held in Seattle together, like a whole bunch, maybe, I don't know, 10 or 15 people from the group went. But Matthew Vines, you may know or may not know, he created a video in about 2013 that went viral. It's had like, I don't know, 1 million or I don't know how many views, but he basically describes the 6 passages in the Bible and talks about the interpretation of them that was mentioned in the policy, that they reflect the homoerotic world of the ancient world, that they don't reflect anything related to gay marriage today. And so you can look on YouTube, Matthew Vines, and you can find his videos amazing. He's in his 20s. He's a remarkable scholar, but he put all that material into a book. And so we read that book, a chapter a week, talked about it. And, you can read that book too. We brought in guest speakers. One of the guest speakers we brought in, this was turned out to be one of the, I don't know, kind of mind-blowing things for me, one of many of the mind-blowing things about this group. So this guy was a LGBTQ plus advocate within the Methodist Church. And we brought him in to talk about trans people, because our group, we had gays and lesbians in the group, but no trans people. And so first thing he said was, so why do trans people not come to church? What do you think? So we proposed this idea, that idea, what might it be? And he said the biggest reason trans people don't come to church is the bathrooms, the toilets. They're worried that the toilets in the church building are going to be, a bunch of stalls labeled for men and a bunch of other stalls labeled for women, and they don't know if they're going to be allowed to go to the bathroom that suits their preference. This guy says, the major thing that you can do to welcome trans people is to have a toilet that's labeled family toilet. And it's just a single toilet. And it's great because dads of like a 6-year-old daughter can bring in their daughter and they don't have to choose which gender bathroom to take them into. And it's great for trans people. And we're just kind of going, really? Huh? And to me, that is the quintessential thing that happened for me in this group, was the whole time I'm going, huh? Really? The stories. Anyway, another speaker we invited was our son, Mike. Mike is now a journalist. He wrote an article, which I've put in the bibliography at the end. You might want to look it up. It's called The Epidemic of Gay Loneliness. It's for the Huffington Post magazine called Highline. And this article has had 6 million views. So this is an article that scratched a huge itch for people. He points out in the article that gay people in countries where gay marriage has been legal for 20 years still have terrible health outcomes and terrible stress compared to non-gay people. What is that? What's that about? So that's what he explores in that article. And we invited him to come and talk about microaggressions. What are microaggressions? And what is it like to be a person who experiences being gay and something else? Being gay and having a disability, or I should say being LGBTQ plus and having a disability, and being in prison and being an ethnic minority. What is that like? And so that multiple microaggressions, that was really interesting. So let me tell you about the membership of the group. Like I said, they've given me permission to talk about this. We have 5 gay men and 1 lesbian woman, stretched in age from in the 20s up into the 80s. We have 1 bisexual person. We have a lot of people who are like Margie, who have a brother, or Dave and me, who have a child who's gay, people who have friends. We've had people come to the group, like maybe they'll come for 4 times in a row because their son has just told them that he identifies as queer. And they don't know how to cope with that. Or they've got a friend, there's most of the people have a relationship with somebody, or they themselves are dealing with the issue. So almost all of our gay members and our bisexual member grew up in evangelical churches, and they still want to be evangelical. That's why they're at Bethany and not at a more liberal church. Several of them tried liberal churches that are way more open to gays and lesbians, but they don't relate to the way the Bible is talked about. They don't relate to the culture of prayer. They are essentially evangelicals. Two of the gay men grew up in families where the father was unbelievably strict and rigid. And those two men are so wounded. The woundedness that they talk about, it breaks my heart. It just breaks my heart. We read a book together called Sex, God, and the Conservative Church by Tina Shermer Sellers. It's about the purity culture. And these two men particularly talked about the impact of the purity culture on them. The scars that we hear about from people in the group or visiting the group are just so real. This is one of the main points that I want to make. My policy of it's not my issue kept me removed from the stories of so many people because I couldn't afford to engage in their stories, because if I really understood their pain, I would have had to do something. And I was determined not to do anything. I was determined to stay silent. And so I robbed myself of years of stories, and I robbed myself of not just stories of pain, but stories of courage. There's really a lot that LGBTQ plus people have to teach us, and we're missing that. Okay, then now I want to focus on Timothy, one of the members of our group. He's the youngest gay man. Timothy, in early 2019, was nominated to be an elder at our church. He would be the first openly gay elder. Now, the session had asked the nominating committee to find them elders who were younger, because, you know, a whole lot of baby boomers have the time and energy after retirement to be on the session. Find us younger elders and ethnically diverse elders. Now, Timothy is Taiwanese descent, identifies as Taiwanese American, and Timothy is in his 20s. Oh, he meets two of those requirements. The elder position that he was nominated for was elder for finance. Timothy, at the time he was nominated, was working as a CPA. I mean, we are talking about a perfect nominee for an elder position, right? He's just what the session wants in every way except, oh, right. He's openly gay. He'd like someday to be married. Oh my, I mean, married to a man, not married to a woman. Oh my, okay, is he really the right person or not? So the congregational meeting to elect Timothy had more than an hour, close to an hour and a half's discussion about Timothy's nomination. The comments were probably 80% in favor, 20% against. And I want to tell you what I said at this meeting. I got up and I said, I love Timothy. He's one of the most mature men I've met. He's perfect for this position. And I am mad at God that this is happening now. Why did God have to rush my schedule? My schedule was we were going to wait a few more years before we had an openly gay elder. We were not going to have controversy for a while longer. We were going to kind of live with this new policy for a while, and we were not going to rock the boat. But God is rocking the boat at this church and calling us to consider a gay elder. So the vote for Timothy was 98 in favor of his nomination and 28 against. So a very strong mandate for him to be on the session. He was elected and 12 more families left the church. For them, this was the breaking point. They could stand the policy, but they couldn't stand the having an openly gay elder. So the irony, I was emailing with Doug Kelly about this, the senior minister. Okay, as I was preparing this, how many people left after Timothy was elected? And Doug said, yeah, well, 12 families left. But you know, in the months after his election, we had more requests to join as members than we'd had for years and years and years. So the church giving has increased. The membership has been constant or increased. I mean, this is my second main point. There is a hunger for an evangelical perspective that is LGBTQ plus friendly. There is a hunger for this. So I sent this, my whole lecture, I sent it out to all the people I'm quoting, and Timothy, after he read it, he wrote back and he said, you need to make that your main point, that there's a hunger for, I wasn't going to say that is the main point, but Timothy said, there is a hunger for an evangelical perspective that is LGBTQ plus friendly. So I'm telling you that he wants me to tell you that that's a main point I want to make. So pushback, I wanted to give you some examples of pushback. One pushback came when we invited that fellow to come and talk to us about trans stuff. I wrote an announcement for the notice bulletin. I was a pastor at this church. I wrote bazillion notices, so I wrote one saying, you're invited to come and hear a guy help us learn more about trans people. And the people who run the adult education program at the church were furious about the way I wrote this. They said, you made it sound like the whole church is hosting this event. It's not, it's your group that's hosting it. We're trying to be a church that affirms different positions. And so I talked with them, I talked with Doug, and all our future speakers, we said it like this. I wrote it down because the wording is important. The Isaiah 43:1 support group is hosting a speaker about transgender people. Guests are welcome. Okay, so it's our group hosting. It's not the whole church. Whole church has a variety of opinions, but our group is hosting. So anyway, fine. I mean, this delicate balance, okay? Some of the pushback comes from our son, Mike. He's really interested in the group, but he thinks Bethany's policy is completely ridiculous. If you're gonna be pro-gay, be pro-gay. Don't do this waffling around stuff, don't try to walk this middle path. And the thing is, he has no understanding of the depth of the friendships of the people, the friendships that I have with people whose husbands have said, I'm leaving the church if we start having gay weddings at church. And that's the next pushback, is the gay wedding question. So I've learned there's the first pushback is we're welcoming LGBTQ plus people. Second pushback, we have an openly gay elder. Third pushback is weddings, and we're not there yet. I'm going to read you the wedding statement out of this new policy. So Paul's going to put it up as it works. There we go. However, no, you got it. Regarding weddings on the Bethany campus, in our process of discernment, the session has focused on revisiting the leadership policy and has not yet addressed our current policy of hosting only marriages between a man and a woman on the Bethany campus. We recognize there are some inconsistencies between our policy on marriage and our policy on leadership. However, the inconsistencies are reflective of our current state of disagreement on this matter and the tensions therein. We also recognize that our current policy places a burden on those who affirm, desire, or participate in same-sex marriage. That said, we recommend settling into our new statement on ordained leadership and pastoral staff before addressing this matter further. It's important to recognize that there is a division of authority regarding conduct of weddings. In our Presbyterian form of government, pastors are given authority to discern whether a couple is ready to enter into the covenant of marriage. However, the local session of a congregation has authority on how the church's property is to be used. Currently, our session's policy does not allow the use of the Bethany property for weddings of same-sex couples. When a wedding is not on church property, Presbyterian pastors are free, based on their own conscience and discernment, to decide whether they will marry a couple. So just leave that up 1 second. Oh, no, go to the next one. No, go to the next one. That's fine. So here's my slide that has the books. And so we'll just leave this up for a couple minutes, and I'm going to just conclude. I have just a couple more sentences to conclude, and then we'll do the Q&A. So this position that Bethany is holding is this really tenuous, bizarre position. And it's crazy that we have an openly gay elder, but we don't allow weddings yet on Bethany's campus. And the funny thing is that the Isaiah 43 group is completely on board with this. The people in the group who are LGBTQ plus say, yeah, if I get married, it's fine with me. I'll get married off campus, doesn't matter, no problem. But it's people in the congregation who are some of them who are saying, this is ridiculous. We need to have gay weddings on our campus. And then there's others saying, as soon as we have gay weddings, I'm out of here. So we've got this, the tension. We're living in a tense place, and it's really complicated. But for right now, it's the right place. And I'm so grateful to all of you for listening to me describe it, because it's pretty tenuous. I'm going to have Paul take the slide down, and then he's going to explain to you about the discussion. I don't think you can see him, but I'm hoping you can